Aqui Ahora, here and now, for a conversation today between Debbie Jaffe and Juan Pablo Cappello. Aqui Ahora is a podcast sponsored by PAG.law, specialists in venture capital throughout the region. Debbie Jaffe, our guest today, believes in leading by example. In 2019, Endeavor Peru, the organization that she leads, made a firm commitment to grow the number of women in its network to about 30%, with the goal of giving women a meaningful voice. Endeavor Peru is part of Endeavor's global network of non-for-profits focused on scaling high-impact entrepreneurs. Debbie has spent 11 years living and working in Peru. Previously, she was the Director of Product Partnerships for Latin America at Google, where she managed data licensing and content partnerships for the region. Debbie is also a well-regarded angel investor and mentor to many local entrepreneurs. Ladies and gentlemen, Debbie Jaffe and Juan Pablo Cappello.
Debbie, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
This is great. You know, I got to say, I always love, I know you've been, living in Peru, I think the last 10 or 11 years. And, Microsoft, you obviously had quite a view of, Google, you had quite a view of the, sort of tech ecosystem, what was going on. But for me, it's always interesting to get the perspective of people who are sort of newish to Latin America, or at least didn't grow up in the region. Because sometimes I feel like, we the locals miss things just because, we have our preconceptions and, it's just sort of the way things have been. Whereas sometimes people that come new to the region see opportunities where the rest of us don't. Did you find that a little bit when you, sort of started getting immersed in the tech and innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it comes in stages. I think when I first moved here, there was a bit of a shock. I lived in Silicon Valley for nearly 15 years before moving here. Right. I worked for Google early on, so I was in the heart of everything. And even just taking...
You went to Stanford too, right?
Yeah, I was Stanford for business school. So all the growth in the internet, but even take something that I really took for granted, like e-commerce and having that readily available, just barely existed in Peru. And I remember going to the second ever e-commerce day, all full of hope and excitement, and walked out really depressed because the biggest showcase of e-commerce was basically just brochureware on the web where you would have to call in. And I was thinking, what have I done? I know for personal reasons, but it was a big awakening for me to see how different it was. Now, fast forward 10 years, and actually now in the current crisis we're in now, it's amazing to see not only the growth of e-commerce, but now the rapid acceleration of the opportunities that have had to come. So that was one, just getting that perspective. The other point of that, in the detail, at that same conference, and this is, I think, different from other countries that I'd visited as part of my job at Google. In other countries, and I'll take Argentina as example, Argentina really got on the map with what I would call copycat products, like
100%.
And e-commerce. Let's go back to that example, like Mercado Libre. Right. And the entrepreneurs and the developers that I interacted with when I was at Google knew that. And we're smart as far as engineering, design, and particularly in gaming, actually really good talent there. But we know we're copycats, and we know we need to get to the next stage. In Peru, I encountered less self-awareness about where they were and where they needed to go. They were so excited about this brochureware online, and not so much about these are the next steps to get us to the next stage. And again, that has very much changed in the past several years, which we can address in other questions. But so for me, that was a rude awakening. I would say the other thing is I really have, throughout these years, used that to my advantage. Well, I'm the foreigner, so I could say and do whatever I want, and right. I'm gonna do anything or care. And I would say that's kind of panned out pretty well.
I'd say so.
That's what I've adapted, and I have family, and I'm very well integrated with my social and professional life. But it's given me a somewhat fearless sense of what's the right word? Transparency.
Right.
and communication where I'm just going to say what I think in my opinion, and they'll just chalk it up to being that crazy American. So, and that's something that maybe I wouldn't have felt if I had stayed in Silicon Valley. And it's really an opportunity to allow us to help the ecosystem grow, I think.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting how, how you're sort of comparing and contrasting a little bit Argentina to Peru. I mean, I got to say one of, my sort of, and, I was in Patagon, which was also a bit of a copycat in the sense it was the first online bank in Latin America. But, constantly people were like, oh, okay, so you're like the E-Trade for Latin America. And even though we hated that, at some point it was like, oh, okay, you want to fund us? Yes, we're the next E-Trade for Latin America.
That's particularly important for investments, but I think that's changing, right. And it has to change.
Right, but I guess my point is the problem I had with the copycats, and obviously Mercado Libre, which is worth on many given days more than eBay, is that many of the copycats were really focused on the top 1% of the wealthiest people in Latin America, rather than really trying to build projects that were going to solve problems for, I don't know if it's the bottom of the pyramid, but at least, the aspiring middle class and that growing middle class. And I got to say that, I've always been a huge supporter of the tech ecosystem in the region, but I was a little, turned off for quite a while that there, so many of the projects that I was, coming across my desk and I was either supporting as a mentor or as a investor, we're not focused on la masa gruesa de nuestros países, and that seems to be changing. I mean,
absolutely,
yeah, and so I'm sort of interested because it does seem in Peru, some of the companies that I've worked with are definitely thinking much more of, for me, what's a really interesting market in Latin America, which is that emerging middle class.
I think there's a number of things that we've seen as trends over the past few years, not only in Peru, but I would say for most of Endeavor, which focuses on emerging markets, but it really put a fine point on it during this particular time period. And there's three industries in particular, but I think even before that, if you look at some of the particularities of our market in Peru, you've got a large unbanked population, which goes along with informality. So street sellers who, don't pay taxes necessarily. You've got a high dense population and terrible traffic.
Yeah.
And so, I'm talking about Lima in particular, but you have that a lot in some emerging market capitals.
Yeah.
And that allows for a certain set of services that are somewhat unique to emerging markets in Latin America or Peru or even Lima. And so just starting with one of them, fintech. A fintech in the US, if you're like an online bank, like you were dealing with, is very different to peer-to-peer micro-lending. And I think you'd hear words like that, 10 years ago, and you would think some sort of social entrepreneurship, but no, these are for-profit, really important part of the economy. And I think now more than ever, Silicon Valley investors have to really recognize that these are new models of business that they have to take seriously because they're really filling a gap for this newly empowered middle class and even more the base of the pyramid of people who aren't banked. So that's one example in fintech. Another would be ed tech. This crisis has been a lot of negative things, but it's really accelerated online education at every level. And this is a mantra that I've said with my team at Endeavor is whatever plans we had, look at them, and the ones that are really important, let's accelerate them. That's going to help us. And I think for schools, whether it's primary schools or universities, they've really had to jump into the deep end of what does ed tech mean. And for our ed tech companies that were kind of like putzing along or even doing quite well, it's really allowed them to shine and have both individual, like in a B2C model, but also a B2B model. It really had to pick up their pace there. And we've even had in Peru, they made an announcement of a bridge round of an ed tech company this week. So there's investments happening and they're trying to move quickly for certain sectors. And then the third, I would say, which I think at least in Peru has been slower to move along, but it's really important now more than ever is healthcare and online healthcare and health tech. So those are three sectors that are really important and have unique commonalities. And then I guess the other one I started with, which is e-commerce and logistics and delivery. We are a food and beverage country. Everyone knows about Peruvian food, and we Peruvians love our food, and we miss our delivery. And so that has really been accelerating certain both e-commerce and payment and logistics platforms that have always been important, but are now more important than ever.
Well, it's interesting because the common thread in everything you're saying is, you guys are, thinking global, but acting local. I mean, these are all things that are solving problems that are real, sort of local problems. I mean, they're not only local to Peru or to Lima, that they are very local to Latin America. One thing talking about sort of solving problems that are relevant. Endeavor's always been focused on trying to get non-traditional entrepreneurs, sort of building companies and scaling companies. I thought it was interesting that you all in Endeavor Peru last year made a sort of a informal commitment to get about 30% of the entrepreneurs you support being women. Obviously, Peru's interesting because you have a large percentage of the population which speaks Quechua and doesn't even speak Spanish. And so, sort of your outreach to women, does that also include outreach to, the local native population as well?
So that 30% commitment was actually a global commitment that we looked at.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
It was 2018 on Women's Day. And but looking at the Peruvian market in particular, one of the things I looked at was global data on venture capital investing. And if you look at venture capital investment data, and the latest data that was available to me when we made this announcement, about 17% of the VC investments went to startups or companies that had women founders. Now, if you compare that to at that time, at the beginning of 2019, so by the end of 2018, 20% of our entrepreneurs were women, which was pretty similar to our network globally at Endeavor. And so we wanted to get a commitment. I should also add, we were committed to getting our whole network up to 30%, not just the entrepreneurs, but mentors and board members and other participants in our network. So now in 2020, we are now at 23%. So we've gone from 80 male, 20% female to 77 to 23. It's been a combination. Frankly, it's not as much as a conscious outreach, but we do find that having more diverse founder teams, our typical profile for an entrepreneurial company that we select has more than one entrepreneur. So our Endeavor entrepreneurs are usually 2 or more founders. And stats show that having more diversity in your founders, especially diversity in gender, leads to success in many ways. And so I think just the nature of the work that we do, and we were able to increase our percentage, but I think it was much more organic. There are some other things that we did. Our team is actually mostly women, just again it wasn't by choice. We happened to be that way. And we've done some programs. We don't do any specific outreach to the Native community. And that's mostly because the companies that we target are in what we call a scale-up phase. So they're much more beyond just a startup in an early phases with product definition and in the market testing and selling. These are companies that are already usually even have a foot outside of Peru and are international and are either somewhere in one of the Pacific Alliance countries, Chile, Colombia, Mexico even. And we just haven't seen those. We're certainly open to founders who Quechua is their initial language. That said, we do some programs where we'll participate and our staff will mentor more bottom of the pyramid social entrepreneurships, but that really isn't our core right now.
And as you think, Peru's for me, always been an interesting, market. How do you see things evolving in the next 4 or 5 years? I mean, do you see local economic groups sort of getting involved? I mean, it's one of the things we're slowly seeing in some of the countries in Latin America is the local economic groups, los grupos industriales, sort of getting off the sidelines and beginning to, I don't know if it's really corporate venture capital, but, at least beginning to have a dialogue. So it's interesting in Mexico, you've seen Cemex Ventures really, sort of making an important play in creating, those conversations with the local, not even startup community, the scale up community, et cetera. You've seen in Colombia, like, the Grupo Santo Domingo taking a lead for quite a number of years. And I'm just wondering, in Peru, how's the conversation going in terms of that?
I would say 2018 and 2019 were breakout years in Peru around corporate venture capital and open innovation, and how corporates are working with scale-ups and startups as well.
Yep.
At Endeavor, we started in this conversation a couple of years ago as well, taking the lead in many parts from Guaira, which is an accelerator part of Telefonica in the region, and really trying to see where these pockets of corporate innovation are happening and how they're working in terms of how they work with startups. And we see everything from just dipping their toe in the water to really advanced innovation centers. So Grupo Breca, which is a very diverse economic group in many different industries, has a center called BRAIN. It's a BREIN, and they do amazing things. It's an internal group that helps facilitate open innovation between startups and scale-ups from all over the world, not just Peru. And
really?
Yeah.
That sounds fascinating.
And we were lucky enough to have on our board the head of that, and he's amazing. And I really love what they're doing, but almost all the big economic groups are doing something or another. Many of them are internal.
Right.
And we actually started working with them to help define what it is they're doing, and particularly when it means they want to do outreach to startups and scale-ups and help them define. Usually there's a very specific business problem they're trying to solve, and they're trying to figure out not just what startups to work with, but how to work with them. How do you go from a 25-page contract or an NDA to a 2-page NDA?
Well, let me tell you, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I've interviewed quite a number of people from WIDA on this podcast already. And I was there at the very beginning of WIDA with Gonzalo Martin Villa, who set it up. And WIDA at the beginning was incredibly criticized because the convertible note that they would have entrepreneurs sign was, like you said, maybe 25, 30 pages, completely one-sided, leonino. And, at the time, they were sort of the only game in town, but, they were really criticized. And it even took WIDA, a couple iterations, et cetera, and actually quite a couple of years before, they realized that, just because they could get these terms from entrepreneurs didn't mean they should get these terms from entrepreneurs.
I think that's a great point. I think it applies to any type of investor in a market that is just taking off. So when I first moved here and angel investing was really just taking off, some of these terms were horrendous. And I said, well, you're inhibiting the startup from growing.
Right.
Because you have blocking rights on any investment with your piddly $50,000 investment. And you bring no expertise to the table other than you're an investor or a banker. So I think it has to change over time, and everyone has to realize that a smaller piece of a bigger pie is worth a lot more than 100% of nothing. So, and that's actually one of the earliest lessons I learned in Silicon Valley when I worked for my first startup and I was negotiating my salary. And I remember a friend telling me, but you only have this percent of the company. And I said, 1% of $1 billion is a lot more than 50% of zero. And so it's something that you do get, whether it's corporate or angel or whatever, that initial mentality of someone who's new in this investment space, who they think, well, hey, I can get more of this and have more control. Well, the idea of entrepreneurship is you put money where you think things are going to grow, and you give all the support you can to the entrepreneur, and then you just get out of the way and let them do their thing. As an investor, right? I mean, obviously you want to support them where they need it.
No, well, it's interesting because even in the United States, I mean, to be fair, we for a long time have had sort of the East Coast, West Coast, and we're not talking, Biggie Smalls and the other guy who died, not the rap wars,
right.
but the West Coast form of documents, which over time have sort of prevailed because the MVCA forms, et cetera, were really focused on the upside, right? Whereas you've always had this pushback a little bit from East Coast venture capital firms, where a lot of those people come from a more Wall Street private equity background, and they're more focused on the downside protection. And so, I agree with you. I sort of get it, but But I remember there was this great company. It was a Chilean company called Tres Segundos. It was basically like Snapchat at the beginning, where emails and pictures were just up for 3 seconds. And they raised, a little bit more money than what you mentioned from a local investor. He got blocking rights. He had all these, silly rights, control rights, blocking rights, it's a bunch of anti-dilution protection. The company was doing great. This was before Snapchat launched. And they were in Silicon Valley. They'd basically, tenían palabreado around about $20 million coming into the company, assuming the Chilean angel investor would give up his rights. And the guy blocked it. The company didn't get the money and died. And, Snapchat came, a few months later, and obviously, has written history. So
I think being a laggard, we have an advantage if we can learn from that. And so
yeah.
I know I actually listened to your podcast with Greg the other day, and you talked about leapfrogging, and that is definitely something that we do here a lot. And part of it is learning, and some of it is having lived those experiences, whether it's abroad or in other companies. So that's something we can really do. One of the great examples of that is when I joined Endeavor, they was just the formation of our local venture capital association called PAG.law. And one of the first things they did was kind of create this open source resource library of legal documents that startups could use to negotiate their seed rounds based on US templates and everything. Obviously, it was adapted to Peruvian law through some of the legal partners they had, but it's sort of like everybody's moving towards the same goal, whether it's the lawyers or the investors or the startups. So right now, we're kind of one big happy family, which I like. On the corporate side, we're trying to bring them to.
Let me just, even though that sounds very obvious and easy, I mean, I can tell you 7-8 years ago in LAFCA, the Latin American Venture Capital Association, they undertook a very similar initiative. And I was like, great. I mean, let's just, take the Series C.com documents, whatever, some standard template.
Ours were seed. That shows you what level we're at.
Yeah. But the incredible thing was, it was one of those initiatives that just collapsed because people couldn't get on the same page. So the fact, as you say, that even though it doesn't sound like a great milestone, the fact you guys in Peru were able to work together and come up with a set of documents that people sort of, signed off on and are working with, I mean, that's actually a real sign of a very functional ecosystem that's very collaborative.
Well, and back to your last question on the corporate side, I think a big milestone for PACAP, this association of seed and venture capitalists, investors, is we have some of our new members are corporate venture capitalists. So the VC fund behind Bellcorp's VC fund. So Bellcorp's another great example of corporate venture. And they're very focused on corporate venture capital on the investment side. Are new members of PACAP, which I think is great having them at the table. I think one of the challenges we've seen, and we talked about this earlier, and one of the things we're trying to help is we're calling it a corporate track. So how do we help corporates understand what it's like to work with startups and scale-ups? And then how do we help startups and scale-ups understand what it's like to work with corporates? So your VC pitch is not the same as your sales pitch. And the contracts aren't going to be the same. The payments aren't going to be the same. So really trying to be that person in between that trains both sides and eventually steps out of the way and helps them both grow.
No, it's really true what you say. I mean, even when you're pitching a more traditional venture capital investor as opposed to a corporate venture, corporate venture capital investor. I mean, what I always, try to remind entrepreneurs is remember that the person in a corporation, if they make a mistake, they can lose their job.
Well, I think it depends. I mean, it gets into this nuance because we talk about corporate venturing and then there's corporate venture capital. And one of the things I love about how Bellcorp set their up is it's a separate fund.
Oh, okay. So it's really
the GPs are the owners of Bellcorp, but versus a balance sheet investment, which is just corporate venturing. And so what we like to see is what we call venture clienting. So you might be one of the first corporate customers of this startup, but you've never worked with startups before. So it's not necessarily a traditional investment for equity. But you're investing you're kind of betting on this startup that as a provider, as a vendor, And there could be a path to investment or acquisition. And I would say one of our first corporate projects, we sort of left it open. Like, we're going to do matchmaking between you and a bunch of startups and scale ups. And you guys decide, do you want them as a vendor or an investment or an acquisition? And we realized, well, maybe that's not the best menu, because you would never buy before trying. And you wouldn't invest before at least, you say, and so we used to say at Google all the time, eat your own dog food. So really that first path is venture clienting. And so, but all this is so new in Peru, and it's really exciting to learn from other offices in Endeavor all over emerging markets and see what they're doing. And there's very different models all over the world. And we also have to keep in mind that Peru is a relatively small economy. When you're talking about Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, you're talking about, yes, big economic groups, but there's tons of them. Here, you can count on one, maybe two hands. Right. So you want to make sure you do it right the first time before going to some of their other, businesses. Right.
On the other hand, we're at this inflection point. I mean, it really does feel, with this pandemic, the pace of, the digital transformation, everyone can agree. You're seeing it happen literally before our eyes. Somebody made that point that there's often decades where nothing happens, and there's sometimes, weeks where a decade happens.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but to think what was my life, March 10th before, the world, this reality came sort of toppling down on top of me. And to think, we're only sort of 2 months into it, and it feels like 3 lifetimes ago. It seems like, in places like Chile, which started quite a while ago with Startup Chile, and obviously that's where Endeavor, between Chile and Argentina, where Endeavor started. There's a big head start, but there's also years of sort of fits and starts, right? Where corporates did engage for a while. Maybe they were a little too early. They lost interest because, that things weren't happening fast enough. And, a place like Peru maybe just, times it right, and it can really just leapfrog some of these other countries.
I would say, in this case, so we've seen 3 types. We've kind of bucketed our entrepreneurs into 3 types. Mm-hmm. One, and we are heavy in our portfolios, over 50% restaurants and retail.
Oh, okay.
And in Peru, all delivery was also shut down. So complete shutdown of all operations for these types of organizations. And so really that was just about like cash preservation and trying to survival, right? And in the between, we saw companies that were on the verge of a digital transformation that were able to immediately accelerate it. So, in the first example was restaurants, right? The second example was Cappello, who today just launched their digital studio, or this week. Cappello is it's called KO Urban Detox Center. I don't want to say they're a gym because they're a lot more than a gym. They are a lifestyle, but they have gym and yoga and nutrition. And for a long time, they've been working on this digital platform. Well, here comes the quarantine, and you have a lot of people who want to work out from home. So one of their founders, Areosa, who's an amazing entrepreneur, but also an amazing teacher, started on her Facebook page, like every single day, multiple workouts. Right away. And so it was a way for them to immediately reach their clients without waiting around. And then they were able to accelerate their existing investment and development of their digital platform. And we're seeing that a little bit in healthcare too, in one of our healthcare entrepreneurs that's still in progress. But and then was this third category of enablers. So we have logistics and e-commerce and digital transformation consulting companies that are now helping those in-between ones to accelerate, but also now really helping that first category of retail and restaurants who were so far away from e-commerce, but now can just plug into a platform and turn the key, and assuming they meet all the government guidelines, start their e-commerce when they really couldn't before. So really starting stores online.
Oh, wow.
Kind of from one day to the next. So that's really enabled, almost all of our entrepreneurs are active in one way or another in these 3 categories. So that's been really exciting to see.
And when you look out, obviously we're gonna get through this pandemic. Hopefully, no tiene alta y bajas, where we're back in quarantine in a few months. So I do think there's going to be some It's not going to just be a steady path to a complete reopening of the economy. But when you look out a couple of years, you've obviously seen the way Peru's been evolving the last 10, 11 years. How do you think Peru's going to, or what role do you think Peru's going to take sort of in the regional tech ecosystem?
I think we're really going to shine in certain digital areas. Ones I touched on earlier, like fintech. I think given the nature of this economy of informality and large base of the pyramid and microtransactions, it is not unique to Peru, and puts us in a position to really refine that. Other entrepreneurs have said Peru is a nice playground to test things out. One of our entrepreneurs, Chasqui, which is a logistics company, they're in Argentina. They just announced an acquisition in Chile, if I'm not mistaken, and they're in Mexico. They're a logistics provider for Amazon. But they can try out new products and services in Peru because it's not a teeny tiny economy. It's and population either. Chile's got a big economy, but a small population. And it's nice, a safe zone then to go out and try that. We have an online insurance company that started in Peru and in Mexico. So I think when you're an entrepreneur in Peru, you have to start by thinking at least regionally, if not globally. When you're in Mexico and Brazil, you have the luxury of not necessarily needing to do that from day one.
Exactly.
And so that's great because you can grow on your own home turf. But you may not have in the mentality of the business model or even in the code base the ability to copy into other regions and easily grow into these other regions. Now, that said, I think you have to be careful about what we're predicting in terms of regional and global expansion. A lot of companies have slowed down or stalled that expansion to preserve cash flow and to tap into their existing customer base and kind of preserve their existing customer base and taking care of their customers. I'm hoping that's really a short-term reaction, and that in the medium and longer term that we activate this regional and global growth. But I think that's inherent in a Peruvian entrepreneur that you may not see in other bigger economies.
Yeah, I think there's an X factor also in Peru that, I think we've seen play out in Colombia, where, I've been sort of scratching my head. It's so interesting to see Colombia be a spawning ground of so many, emblematic unicorns and ponies in the region. And talking to some people in Colombia and knowing some of those entrepreneurs, they were part of this diaspora that went to the United States because of issues in Colombia in the 90s and early 2000s, and then they came back to Colombia and began building companies. And certainly that happened in Peru as well. As opposed to Chile, where very, very few Chileans, other than maybe go to the United States to get a graduate degree or whatever, everyone sort of came back. People didn't really live in the United States and get culturally connected the way, a lot of Peruvians that I know did, and, their children's did.
Yeah, I think, when you look at, thinking of our portfolio, a lot of the e-commerce and digital companies do have those founders that lived abroad, studied abroad, and came back. But not all of them.
I know not all of them. But what's nice about those founders is, as you say, Peru, you probably aren't going to build, the next unicorn if Peru's your only market, unless you're in, la minería or, some specific industries. So, most companies obviously are going to have to regionalize. And, those kinds of entrepreneurs, I think, are, in a good position to do that.
We had an excellent mentor. I want to say he's based out of Singapore. He's a VC, and he talked about the rhinoceros and what's going to thrive now. And it's sort of like this really powerful but short horn. So it's not the unicorn. It's the one that's going to trudge through. And I feel like we have an opportunity for that in Peru. And here's why. I think, if you asked me 6 months ago, what do I think of the characteristics of a typical Peruvian entrepreneur? And coming from Silicon Valley, I felt like they were a little bit more risk averse. And I think part of that was because of the lack of local venture capital. They're dealing with their own money or their angel investors' money, where you tend to be a little bit more timid. And I think only when you get venture capital money and you feel like, you could seek a little bit more risk and think a little bit bigger because you have the capital, which is scarce in Peru. But it's not your own money. It's not the money of your friends and family. So it's a different mentality. I think that's really worked in our favor in this situation because it's been slow and steady. So some of our most promising entrepreneurs have had really good growth. Has it been explosive? No, but it has been slow and steady and up.
Right.
And those are ones that are actually on the radar of VCs now. Either the rounds have been closed recently during the crisis, or have been on pause and maybe are being adjusted. So I think that characteristics will play in our favor. And it reminds me of when the bubble burst in 2000 in Silicon Valley. I had just graduated from Stanford Business School, and most of my friends and I had been laid off from our jobs. And there was a slow and steady company that was really building stuff on good technology that was humble and lean. And I remember looking at them I had an internship at a tech company, and they sent me a link to a Stanford link to a technology, and it was called Google.
Wow.
And so, if you compare them to the flamboyant companies that were given forced growth from their VCs,
Right.
and we have seen that in Silicon Valley, in Latin America, this forced growth curve.
Absolutely.
We haven't seen that in Peru. So I think you're going to see emerge those that have been like slow and steady and have had their heads down, working hard to grow, and haven't taken, and this is a criticism I have, but now I think it's a strength. But now I think it's a strength, is didn't take more capital than they needed, even looking out more than 6 months or a year. And we're content with smaller, more frequent rounds than this giant round that they had to grow into. And a few months ago I would have criticized that, and I think that's really worked in our favor, because potential investors can look back at that and see how well they've done, but also the startups don't feel obligated to continue on their paths, and they're more agile to reinvent themselves in this time.
Right. No, that's what I always, make the point that just because you can, maybe you shouldn't take the money, because you and I know that, whenever you're next raising money, the investors are expecting you're going to double or triple the valuation of the company relative to the last round. So now you took money at 15. Now at the next money you take in, investors are hoping 30 to 45 million valuation. So before, with the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm sure plenty of people who are listening to us are people who, entrepreneurs who are either thinking about coming to Peru to start a company, or entrepreneurs who have a company that's looking to expand in another market, and they're thinking about Peru as being maybe a test market for Latin America, as you said, or maybe another market to add to their string of flags in terms of operations in Peru. So I know you're not the Peru welcome wagon, or the equivalent of Corfo, but what do you think of the opportunity in Peru for those kinds of international projects looking maybe to land in Peru?
Well, first I'm going to correct you. I see one of my missions when I go to one of our international selection panels is to sell Peru to the international investment community, to entrepreneurs, because our competitors are you guys in Chile and Colombia. Because when a Mexican entrepreneur is thinking where to expand, if they're thinking about
Machu Picchu, Cusco, and the best
and the best food, right?
So, I don't want to think about who's if Pisco is Chilean or Peruvian.
We're not going to do that today. We won't do that today, I promise you. But when I think of who our competitors are, if you look at like the natural flow of workers in terms of expanding a company, because often you plant someone from your existing company from your country to the new one. The Pacific Alliance is an obvious choice for the region if you're in that alliance. And so look at our competitors and say, what can we do as Endeavor to make that a no-brainer that you're going to come to Peru?
Right.
So we've partnered with EY to create a guide to launch your startup in Peru. We've worked with the Peruvian government in the Ministry of Production in Innovate to in their program for soft landing, and it's actually part of our mission in Endeavor is help access to markets. So not only helping our entrepreneurs move to other countries, but to receive. And so my team and I are very proud to do whatever we can to help facilitate that. I think it's still a work in progress as a country and a government to make that easy, but there's a lot of organizations that are really looking forward to that, because we know that we can't grow as an economy unless we think regionally and help bring in that, on the other side, it's bringing in that entrepreneurial talent to help us learn of what it means to start up a company and grow a company, because we don't have a lot of experience doing it. So if we can get other countries here to do it, we love to have them. So, and then of course there's the good food, as you mentioned. But yeah, we've seen a number of companies come in the past couple of years, and the government has some subsidies to help them do that. And they're still refining what that program is and how it works. So my advice would be Peru is by nature an entrepreneurial country. And I'm not just talking about the person, selling something on the corner. It's always figuring out how to solve problems, because maybe the infrastructure and the world around them didn't deal them the best set of cards, so they had to work around that.
Right. Yeah. No. I have. It's interesting because I've had the conversation. I've been dealing a lot with European founders who are looking to, launch their business, their technology into Latin America. And I actually often recommend Peru above Chile, interestingly enough, because my point is, it isn't that Chile stands outside of Latin America, but just because you can succeed in Chile doesn't mean you can succeed in the rest of the region. Whereas I tend to agree with you. I think, Peru has the scale in the way, countries in Central America don't. And it's, sort of complex enough that if you can succeed in Peru, then go to Mexico, go for the big prize. But my advice is always don't start in Mexico. God, that's a fool's errand. Start in a market that's a little, less competitive. But that's a market that's, you're going to face a bunch of the same challenges you're going to face when you ultimately go to Mexico. So no, I totally agree. Debbie, I love what you're doing. I love what Endeavor's doing. I really want you to know that, when I started, on this journey of entrepreneurship in Latin America, 20 plus years, I could only dream that people like you would, be in the region collaborating with people like me, and that would be, remando juntos for the good of the TecnoLatino. So thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's really been my honor. This question I'm going to ask in Spanish. Please answer it in English, but if not, I'm terrible at translating. I'm not good at code, notwithstanding the 20 years in Miami. ¿Qué mensaje le quieres pasar a los hinchas del TecnoLatino aquí ahora para que mantengan el optimismo y la fortaleza en estos momentos difíciles?
So what words would I give to the fans of TecnoLatina given the current circumstances? Well, I'd like to quote a mentor of ours, Toddy Hall, who just gave an amazing webinar. I actually have it here written on my desk, so I'm going to read it right off. Uncertainty favors entrepreneurs. We're nimble, we're fast, and we thrive on opportunity, maybe when larger actors can't. So go for it now.
Go for it. Go big or go home. That's Endeavor's mission.
Yep.
We love you. We love what Endeavor's doing. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Este fue otro programa de Aquí y Ahora, auspiciado por PAG.law, especialista en Venture Capital. Hasta pronto.